I'm creating a Zelda-like inspired primarily by games like Minish Cap. When I look for a new game to play, I tend to search for Zelda-likes, especially indie Zelda-likes. But at this point, I feel like I've played pretty much all of them, unless you can recommend me one now that I have not yet played. People tend to recommend the same game over and over again in this genre, and it feels like there's a lot more new stuff happening in Metroidvanias than there is Zelda-likes, although the two are extraordinarily similar. Nothing left me with more of an itch to play a Zelda-like than Nintendo's latest releases in the Zelda series. They don't have that same Zelda-like feel that I'm looking for in a game, so why not just make my own? I have professional experience with object-oriented programming languages like Python, D-Flat, Java, and others, but I have little to no game engine experience, and that's where the challenge of this is going to come in. My first step is installing Godot. For my first time in the engine, I need to familiarize myself with Godot and how it works, so I'm going to mainly focus on the 2D space here. I now have some resources that I've purchased on itch. Everything that I use that I bought is going to be linked in the description in case you want to go and get it for yourself. Here's a big boar dude with a huge tree trunk weapon. He needs to chill out, so I'm giving him a teddy bear. Okay, that teddy bear is too big, so let's scale him down. Alright, well, he can't play with it unless he has collision configured, so let's set that up. Cool, I think I get it, and let's start scripting. I start off with a basic score script that wasn't working for me at first. See if you can spot the issue here. Before I start working on my own game, I'm going to familiarize myself with the engine by using some tutorials. I don't want to spend too much time following tutorials or other people's guidance because I need to set my own foundation, but this is going to give me a good idea of how I navigate the engine and how the engine talks to itself. Like I'm doing right now. The first tutorial is the creation of a basic 2D platformer. I feel like most tutorials when you're first getting started with a game engine tend to lean in this direction. So to start off, I drag in this ninja, set the pivot point to be close to his feet, and then set up some bad enemies and a very basic level. Terrific! Now we can go ahead and attach our script and get started, beginning with a speed float. One thing I want to touch on here is that export variables are extremely valuable tools that I have found I really enjoyed, especially being able to sort them with categories, groups, and subgroups. With the bulk of my player variables configured, I went on to set up movement, which was extremely easy. Probably the second easiest time that I've ever had setting up movement for a character in a game, with the first easiest obviously being RPG Maker 2003. And it works. He even falls to the platform like I 100% intended to do. That was a test. Now let's set up these collectible shurikens. Okay, they're butt plugs. They're 100% butt plugs. Again, resources in the description if you want to research this for your own purposes. Anyway, I set up a basic automation for the butt plugs in the script. I have them bob up and down, spin around, that sort of thing, which spinning something in a 2D space is really just a matter of scaling it on an axis to make it look like it's spinning. Next, I need the player to actually be able to pick up the butt plug because that's important. You can't just leave those lying around, and it takes me a minute to get that, but eventually it is picking it up and being added to a score in the top corner. Before I move on to the next project, I do the very important work of setting up the title screen with a bit of drop shadow for the butt plugs just to really emphasize it. Now, the next tutorial that I did was for creating a game that is essentially a Pokemon 1v1 battler. This is going to involve a lot of things that were important to know for using the Godot engine, especially resources. This is a very resource-heavy tutorial, so learning how to use those, learning how to have them work the same way for player characters and AI, that I was already envisioning how I would employ that in my own game. The first step is to just set up the basic scene with a background and a couple of characters, and then I also go in and add a health bar to that, and you can easily see how I'm already going to be able to expand on that and change out sprites and that sort of thing, but it was really easy to set all of that up and get my initial process going before I started adding all of my code. After some work, I was able to get the code working, and now I have a really riveting, exciting 1v1 battler, as you can see here. It's exciting stuff, but it's definitely missing some juice, as they call it. No, really, they do call it that. If you look up game juice on YouTube, you'll find tons of videos about it. But yeah, my game needs some OJ, so I'm gonna go ahead and sprinkle that in here with a few flashing sprites and a moving background. One thing I want to note about the moving background is that the tutorial just had you move the background at a flat rate. I went overboard, as I tend to do, and took a lot of time to program it so that the background would move at a rate that was based on the average amount of hit points missing between the two characters. If the game is more intense because somebody has lower hit points, it's going to move a little bit faster, and if it's really intense because both characters are missing a lot of hit points, it's going to move extremely quickly. Now, for my third and final tutorial game, I was creating something that actually did really interest me, and that is a top-down RPG. That's basically what I'm trying to make as my own game. The very first step that they had us do was create a world. I did that really quickly and really well, and I definitely don't have any issues whatsoever with using Godot's tile map editor, and I definitely think it's not one of its weak points. So anyway, I set up my world with some trees and some paths, and I was ready to go ahead and get in there and start programming a player character. So I dragged in this player sprite, and then I put on my glasses so that I could actually see him clearly because he was kind of blurry. And there he is, being all cute in the game. He moves around a little bit, and he's also really tiny, so I make everything 3 times bigger, meaning that I just zoomed in the camera. The next thing that came was weapons. Now, the weapons in this tutorial are modular. You can create an axe and a sword and a bow, and any character is going to be able to use them, whether it's the player or a giant cyclops or an evil wizard, whoever it is, you can give them that weapon and they are able to use it. Not exactly the kind of thing that I'm going to be doing for my game, but I could see how a feature like this would be useful for my game and how I could manipulate it to do what I wanted to do. I was really enjoying how informative this project was, and it was only just getting started. Things get a lot more complicated from here, and we also create some systems that are absolutely going to help me out with creating my own systems the way that I want to. For example, the next one we do is an inventory. Now, it's not the kind of inventory that I would want, but there are a lot of elements here that I can pull from to create my Zelda-like inventory that I'm envisioning. Also, the inventory and shop system and all of that, it just taught me so much about how the UI elements work. Before long, I have a shop system, I have an inventory, and I even have a dialogue system that is working in my game, which is really nice. And it, again, just gave me all sorts of ideas for how I could change this system to make it work the way that I want it to in my own game. The dialogue system, especially in this tutorial, was not as robust as what I want and need, but it was a really good jumping off point for me to learn from, so that when I build my own dialogue system from the ground up, it functions the way that I want and need it to. Anyway, now that I've got a shop and some dialogue and a wizard who gives you a sword and a dungeon and all of that, I actually have a game loop when I think that we're done with this tutorial. Again, I really don't want to spend too much time doing just tutorials that show you how to make an entire game, when I think that's going to give me maybe some habits that aren't going to be as helpful for me as they would be for somebody else. So I'm going to move on now from doing these tutorials and learning the engine that way to actually creating my own game and learning the engine as I go. I think I've got a good enough foundation now that doing more tutorials would just be procrastination, and I don't want to procrastinate. So now it's time for me to make my game's Figma. Okay, I procrastinate a little bit, but I feel like the Figma was kind of important to put together. The first thing I did was grab some screenshots from my comp, which is Minish Cap. So I went into Minish Cap and I got a ton of screenshots. This was also an excuse for me to replay Minish Cap. Next, I made my controller layout. I do think, again, I know I'm procrastinating here and just not getting started on my own game, but I do also think that having a controller layout early on makes it a little bit easier for me to innovate and expand on my game and remember what each button does before I have everything kind of on screen and obvious. So knowing how I want to map out the controller and holding it in my hand while thinking about what I want that button to do with the game was really helpful for me here. And I was ready to move on to the next part, which was outlining my ideas for items. Oh, yeah, I was definitely procrastinating at this point. There's not really an excuse for that. One more thing in the Figma, which was setting up the entity class states. Classes in Godot are really handy. You can have subclasses of a class that extends that class so that you can then use the functions and variables of the parent class in that subclass. I felt like it was important for me to essentially map out how these classes were going to work in what was called the entity class. And the entity class is one I wanted to encompass anything from characters like NPCs, enemies, and even the player to interactables and dynamic or static objects, things like that. All of those are going to be encompassed by the entity class. So I wanted to make this big, robust class that then had tons of granular subclasses that handled more niche scenarios. I don't think I can procrastinate much longer, so let's go ahead and actually make the game. Now that I've established the entity class, it's time for me to actually go in and start setting it up, which turned out to be mostly busy work of just creating all of these classes and subclasses and chaining all of them together. But because I had my map that I'd made in the Figma, see, the procrastination was worth it. I was able to do this pretty quickly and stay on track and remember how I had envisioned everything very easily, even a couple of days after first making that diagram. Once I had these outlines built, I jumped into the editor and began changing the way the editor looked. Just one tiny little bit more procrastination before I get started. Now, with the bulk of my entity class configured, it was time to actually move on to setting up the character, the player character specifically. There's lots of character entities. To do that, I needed some placeholder animations, or maybe I just wanted some placeholder animations, but I grabbed this off of itch.io, and again, that will be linked in the description. This is a really cool Zelda-like pack that has a ton of things in it and is very reasonably priced, so I definitely recommend it. But I set up the character, set them up with some walking animations. I did at first use a animated sprite 2D to do this. That was the wrong move. The reason for that being that you cannot call functions from an animated sprite 2D, so I wound up having to redo all of this work setting up the frames later. Eventually the player was walking around just as I intended, so it was time for me to set up the in-game UI. Kind of like in Minish Cap, you have, you know, displays for your buttons, and even in Ocarina of Time, you have button displays that tell you if you're attacking or rolling or whatever it is you're doing. I wanted to set up this in-game UI that showed you a layout of the controller so you could have a quick reference. Especially once you have things like items, it's going to be really handy to know which button is matched to what is God. Especially once you have things like items, it's going to be really handy to know which button is mapped to which item. So I wanted to make this on-screen in-game UI early on. What's this? Sure, I can credit you. One thing that occurred to me while setting all of this up is that it would be really cool to be able to support any screen size and aspect ratio. So I wanted to get that established early on, how that would look if, for example, you were to switch to a square screen. The first step that I had to do was obviously just get the viewport rect, then do a bunch of math incorrectly, and it works. Everything looks good and nothing is wrong. Something is very wrong, but I'll figure it out later. While setting up the in-game UI, I also programmed the Zelda-like camera that I wanted. Instead of just doing a room-by-room transition, it was going to follow you around the map within that map's predefined bounds, and those bounds are actually pulled automatically based on the ground layer of the tile map. I don't think this is the best way for me to do this, but it works for right now. There is a bit of a problem with the on-screen UI, which is that the player can walk underneath of it and be obscured. So I needed it to fade out, but I didn't want to check every single frame from every UI element whether or not the player was underneath of that UI element just to trigger a fade out. That seems like a huge waste of resources. What I wound up settling on is still not a great answer. I don't think there's almost definitely going to be a better way for me to do this, and if you have suggestions, I'm open to them. But what I wound up doing was just having a timer that ticked 10 times a second. That timer is tied to the player UI's parent, like the root node, so that the UI can then send that information out to everything else to tell it, hey, check if the player's underneath of you so that you can fade out. And that works. There's got to be a better, more efficient way to do something like this. It's a very basic function, I think, so I'll have to figure that out later. But right now it works, and I can see the player when they go under the UI, and I'm going to move on from there. Okay, I have two more critical components that I want to set up for the player before I call it good. And the first one is heart. Zelda's health system is really unique, and always has been, and I want the same system. This wasn't too difficult to set up, but it was a little clunky in my code. It doesn't look great. It's not very pretty code, but it does function. Essentially, I have a unique atlas texture for every single heart sprite, and the heart sets its own texture value to the relevant variable atlas texture based on its own numeric value in the health array. This took me a minute to figure out how to set up and how to connect everything together through a heart container that talks to each individual heart within it, but eventually I got everything working. I also added things like heart beating and red flashing when you're low on health, which brings me to the low health threshold, because I wanted this to be dynamic, and I spent a little bit too much time trying to set it up to do that. It didn't look or feel very good when you have 20 hearts to have 5 hearts be what's considered low health, because while yeah, you're missing a lot of hearts, you also still have plenty remaining. 5 hearts is 20 hit points, so I set a cap for the maximum number of hearts this could be. But you also run into the problem of when you only have 3 hearts, that's 15, and rounding that down 25% of that, you're looking at about 3 or 4 hits, which doesn't really tell you the information that you need early enough, because you might want to know before you only have less than a heart remaining that you are low on health. So I set it up so that there was also a minimum value, and that's what this math is. It's just telling you that if the hearts are within this set range, then make it 25%, otherwise make the minimum this and make the maximum this. If your hearts are within that range, you're considered to be at low health, and things like heart beating sounds and red flashes and things like that will occur. So it's a really long way to walk for a small drink of water, but it functions. Now the next critical thing I wanted to set up for my game before delving into other things was the context button for the player. This is the function in Zelda games that tells you, for example, if you're running and you press A, you'll roll, and there's a little bit of text that says you're going to roll when you push that button. You use it to speak, use it to roll, use it to lift things, throw them, and I wanted the same button in my game. So I needed to set it up so that there was text over the Y button that shows whether or not you can roll or what action it is you're about to take, and then actually configure that and tie it into various things. So it turned out to be a little bit easier to set up than I expected. I have it do that rotating thing like with the butt plugs, where it will rotate this way when you switch the text, and right when it's at 0 is when it changes the text, so you don't even really notice it happening. So it will roll over at 0, change text, and then roll back and show you the new option in the context menu. So you can just go back and forth between rolling and speaking and that sort of thing. Yeah, you can step in there and it says speak. That doesn't actually function right now. I will talk about my dialogue system another time. For now, let's just get these things committed to the GitHub repository, and there we go. You can also get all of my code on the GitHub repository, which will be linked along with all the resources that I used to make my game so far. In my next devlog, I'm going to be creating my game's unique dialogue system. I know there's some dialogue plugins out there that are pretty great, but they don't do exactly what it is that I want to do with my system, and I also want to be able to build my own from the ground up and fully understand it that way, as opposed to having to learn an additional system on top of everything else I'm already learning about the engine. So I'm building out my own dialogue system. So we'll talk about that in my next video. After giving over 6 years of my life to a company, I was laid off along with a number of other people earlier this year. So most of my time right now is going toward trying to find a job, but in my free time, I'm enjoying doing something like this and finding a passion in it. You taking the time to support this in whatever way you can, even just watching it or liking or whatever, is really appreciated, and it's helping me out on my journey through here. Things are pretty rough out there, but being able to find joy in creating a game like this is pretty great. Thank you for taking the time to share in that with me, and I will see you next time. How do I stop this?